Welcome on behalf of Archer, and good morning and good afternoon, depending where in the U.S. or potentially the world you are sitting today. We've got a few folks from Europe that have been joining us, which has been great to see some of our clients there. So as people are filing in here virtually, if you will, maybe first I'll say on behalf of Archer, first and foremost, we hope that all of your friends, family, coworkers are all safe and healthy. And second of all, for all of our electric utility partners, thank you for everything that you're doing through this very challenging time. We greatly appreciate all the extra effort and focus and everything you're doing literally to keep the lights on. So thank you. Today we're going to discuss, this is our third installment of the Ask the Expert series hosted by Archer. We're going to discuss the new supply chain risk management standard and also spend some time on the other standards that are impacted, standard 5 and 10. And the purpose of these conversations is to be just that, very conversational. So don't hesitate to raise your hand at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to see a little icon to raise a hand to ask a question. Alternatively, you can go ahead and type in there your questions and we'll answer them real time. And if we get a few more questions than we have time for today, we will always make time and answer them afterwards as well. So we know your time is tight and your time is precious. So we will continue to stay on target. I'm going to do just a quick 2-minute overview on who Archer is for some of you that we may not have worked with in the past, so that you have an idea of who we are. But we will very quickly get to introductions on the panelists and have a great conversation today. So who is Archer? Archer was started about 6 years ago by 4 partners, all who ran large organizations at utilities, whether they were compliance, security, or both. And 3 of the 4 partners actually went on to become auditors, some of the first auditors in the United States for NERC CIP compliance. Above and beyond our focus on our partners has really been the growth that we've seen and the resources that we've brought in. Archer has been really focused on bringing in credentialed, experienced resources across many different verticals and many different systems in order to bring our growing client base even more value, whether it's on cybersecurity, physical security, compliance, and that transcends well past the utility space. So we're focused on oil and gas, water, mining, food processing, and many other verticals, specifically where OT is present. So feel free to ask questions today as we kind of jump into our discussion. So first, why don't we go through and let the panelists introduce. We'll start with Patrick and kind of just go clockwise around and have each person introduce themselves, and then we'll get right to the questions. We have some questions that have already been emailed in, and we'll get right to those. So Patrick, if I could, if you want to introduce yourself first.
Sure, fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome everybody to the CIP-013 discussion we're going to have today. Should be lively. This one has been very engaging so far, to say the least. My background, telecom sector in the 80s, moved to the power sector in the 90s, rode out Y2K, went from there all the way into about 2008. Left the utility and became the first CIP auditor in the nation, managed the WEC program for CIP audits and investigations. Ran the DOE National Electric Sector Cybersecurity Organization for a few years. Founder of EnergySec, US coordinator for CCI, and now managing partner with Archer as well.
Yep, good morning. Really looking forward to this webinar. My name is Steve Reed. I've been had the good fortune to be with Archer since the beginning of the company. I came out of the intelligence community, the CIA specifically. I've spent 30 years in communications and cybersecurity, and then after moving out from there, moved on to critical infrastructure and focusing on NERC CIP. I'm currently working with several clients on CIP-013 and looking forward to the questions today.
Thank you, Steve. Leonard?
Hey,
Mute
Leonard,
button,
you're on
Leonard.
mute. There you go.
There we go. If you're playing conference call bingo, then you got a square. So good morning, Leonard Chamberlain here with Archer. Been with Archer for approximately 5 years now. Prior to consulting with Archer, I spent some time as an energy industry analyst with the FERC, both in the Office of Electric Reliability and in the Office of Energy Infrastructure Security. In both those roles, kind of overseeing auditing, compliance, and security for the industry. Prior to that, I spent a number of years in the telecom industry, as well as a major electrical utility, primarily working in substation automation, EMS support roles, and then ultimately implementing controls for NERC CIP compliance. So I'm happy to be here today, and hopefully can share some insight on supply chain that'll help y'all out. And also wanted to take the opportunity to thank you again for all of your efforts in maintaining the bulk electric system during this pandemic. Thank you.
Good morning, Leonard. And Jason.
Oh, sorry. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jason Smith. I've actually been with Archer for the last couple of years. Started in the power sector about 16 years ago in the role of network administrator and system administrator before moving to compliance. Assumed control of the entire compliance program, CIP-2 through 11, going through audits in 5 of the regions, responsible for controls enhancement, oversights, and as well as internal auditing and gap assessment. And I'd just like to thank everybody for having me be a part of this morning.
Excellent. Thank you guys very much. And I'll kind of moderate the day. This is Mark Brahmstadt, Director of Business Development and Sales here with Archer. So Patrick, I don't know if you saw the first question that came in from Mr. Dave. I'll go to the email one next, but if you want to answer Dave.
Thanks. The funny thing is Dave knows the answer to this already. It is pronounced NERC CIP. I'm just kidding. No, it is NERC CIP. Thanks, Dave. And you've got better questions than that, so challenge.
Thank you. I'm gonna start with one that's probably pretty relevant here, given the environment that we're all in, that was emailed in. So what if I'm in the middle of a global pandemic and the need to expedite a purchase from a new vendor? Are there provisions for CIP exceptional circumstances or emergency purchases in the supply chain standard? So I'm gonna ask Leonard to actually take that one.
Sure. Happy to do that, Mark. Wow, global pandemic, that would be pretty unprecedented. Hopefully we'll be proactive and be ready for that instead of reactionary. Anyway, soapboxes aside, I guess first and foremost, the supply chain requirements do not have the CIP exceptional circumstance exception clause. So this means that even in the event that CEC, CIP exceptional circumstances, is invoked, the expectation from a compliance perspective is that all of the supply chain requirements are still met for the duration of those circumstances. You know, we think that provisions for emergencies in all of your processes, including supply chain, are reasonable, you know, to kind of help cut through some of that red tape that sometimes goes with these paper-intensive processes for CIP. Any shortcuts should ensure that all of the explicit requirements of the standard are still met. So, you know, certainly reasonable again to have an option to expedite the supply chain risk management process, but again, make sure that all the explicit requirements go the route.
Yeah, I would add to that there, at least for the instantiation of the standard, they know its effective date has been shifted per NERC request from July 1st out to October 1st. So that's about the only kind of exception that you're going to get based on the pandemic, at least. But yeah, I would agree. There's no SIP exceptional circumstance for the supply chain standards. And that, you know, I think the challenge is going to be in a pinch in situations like this when you need to buy something. This should be a very clear reminder and fresh reminder that this should be built into your process. Something like this exact situation should be factored into your process. If you need to make emergency purchases and it's got to come from, you know, Joe's Bargain IT Shack or OT Shack, what does that look like from a CIP-013 perspective in terms of reactionary or exigent circumstance-induced purchasing?
Great, thank you. I'll deviate from my emailed list to go right to Harold's question. And Jason, I'll point to you on this one as a starting point. Please expound on what is being asked for with installation risk. Doesn't what we do today to make an asset compliant already in place? And this occurs whether a vendor is involved or not.
Sure. In some cases, what you're doing today does address some of the risk, but the requirement of the standards to go through and perform an official assessment on the vendor itself. Do so, go through at least a minimum of the 6 controls and any other criteria that you deem necessary to validate that vendor risk that may be outside the typical SIP controls that you're implementing at this point in time. As you do so, as a part of that assessment, try to leverage the existing controls that you have in place and document that, of course, as evidence of the assessment and the controls implementation.
I think installation is a pretty broad term. There's risks in physically installing a piece of equipment, but there may also be risks surrounding the pre-installation and post-installation of a device. So over to somebody else on the team, but I've heard this before, but installation seems a little bit on the broad side.
Yeah, the standard doesn't speak to installation specifically. It is hardware, software, and services for vendors. Those are the words right out of the standard. It doesn't speak to installation. Obviously, there's some implied components there as well, just because of installation of hardware or software. But yes, hardware and software are key and are part of the standard itself. I agree. In terms of the installation risk itself, that's something that you're going to have to factor in prior to getting to that state. That the whole supply chain risk management approach is to basically have an answer to that before you get to that stage.
Right, and I think that this speaks to the importance of having a solid plan for doing risk assessments, because it takes a lot of these things into consideration. For example, it's considerably much more risky. It's going to be more risky to install open source software than it would be a piece of commercial software. So.
Very good. Thank you, Harold. And if you need a follow up there, if we maybe missed a point, let us know. But we'll move to the next question. And the next question that came in is, what level of actions should an end consumer do on instant transactional and automated purchases where negotiations are not possible? So Steve, I'm gonna tee that one up to you if that's okay. So what level of action should an end consumer do on instant transactional or automated purchases where negotiations are not possible?
Okay, so are we referring to situations here where there's no negotiation and you're not going to be able to put CIP-013 terms and conditions into onto a purchase? Is that, or an acquisition? Is that right?
That's all the detail that was offered.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say for the sake of answering the question, assume that to be the case. Yeah, obviously for the anonymous attendee, if it's different, please let us know in the Q&A window.
Right, right. So if I understand the question correctly, and this is something that we've all run into frequently, and it's a very common issue. First of all, every acquisition that falls under CIP-013, no matter how it's purchased, still needs a risk assessment. And that's the central piece of CIP-013. And you need to do best effort do a risk assessment, and there's a variety of things that would surround a purchase like this. For example, are you purchasing something that is at or beyond end of life? Are you purchasing something through a third party, such as eBay or Amazon, where you can't get CIP-013 terms and conditions? So again, this really comes down to the risk assessment, and more importantly, the mitigations that go along with that. I don't think that a perfect score on a risk assessment is possible. So there's going to be mitigations in almost every single case.
Yeah, I think the short answer is, I mean, whether it's an instant transactional automated purchase where negotiations are not possible, all this means is you don't get anything in the terms and conditions. I mean, in reality, you're not going to get some contractual coverage. The short story is, at the end of the day, you as a responsible entity, as a registered entity, you are left holding the bag. You are responsible for being compliant. Whether your vendors can support you in that effort or not, it's entirely up to you and on you. That's the way the standard is written. The FERC has no jurisdiction on anyone outside of the registered entity space. So they can't regulate Dell and Microsoft and ABB and Siemens, Ovation, Emerson. They can't do that, so they're going to regulate you instead. And by proxy, they're going to, in theory, impact action on your vendor's behavior as a result. More secure products, I guess, is the theory. The reality is, whether it's a pandemic level instant transaction or something you've got a long-term standing contract with, you may or may not get terms and conditions in there. And you may end up having to buy on Amazon. You may end up buying on eBay because that's your only option. Frankly, it's our industry's dirty little secret. We all do it. We know we have to in some cases. But if eBay or Amazon or Best Buy or, like I say, anyone else is your vendor, and you don't have any contractual binding with them on their behavior, you are left to perform a risk assessment and mitigate risks accordingly as a result.
And I want to emphasize one thing, and that's the importance of documentation. Some of my peers on here are former auditors, and I know that they appreciate having evidence. You need to produce evidence that you did a risk assessment, that you have documented mitigations, and that you've made a conscious decision on the purchase. That said, making purchases out of a BCA that would normally come under CIP-013's protocols out of band from another supplier where you can't get CIP-013 terms and conditions, I think really should be avoided if at all possible, because it's going to raise eyebrows with auditors such as Leonard.
Picking on me.
Yeah,
One thing I can, I'm surprised y'all didn't mention, just pick another vendor. No, I think by and large, a lot of them are getting with the program and recognizing that that's the new reality, that these types of terms and conditions will be expected. But seriously though, I completely agree with the comments by Steve and Patrick. The requirement is to have a process that addresses each of these sub-requirements as part of the risk mitigation of procuring hardware, software services. So even if the vendor doesn't agree or can't provide you those terms and conditions, you should still have some alternative means, compensating measures in place to address each of those.
Excellent. Thank you. Next one that just came in from Jennifer. Jason, I'm going to tee this one up for you. How are entities in the industry implementing the vendor-to-vendor transition piece of R1.1? Mute button.
Jason.
Mute
Jason,
button, Jason.
Oh, sorry about that. There's a couple ways I've seen doing it. The most effective that I've seen personally at this point in time is treat the assessment the same process you do to perform on another vendor. In other words, issue out your vendor questionnaire to that vendor prior to bringing them on board. Do that beforehand, document the assessment itself, and look at the actually risk posed by that vendor. And then look at what other controls you can implement internally prior to usage of a product from that vendor.
Yeah, I think to add to that, Jason, we're seeing varying degrees of quality and risk mitigation and supply chain security management from vendors in terms of their responses. Some vendors respond, some vendors don't. Some vendors provide kind of a data sheet up front that lets you know where they already stand with respect to these things. And some are just a black hole where you send questions and no answers come. So the vendor questionnaire certainly is a fantastic idea and it should be issued, but set your expectations accordingly. And, I guess if we all ask our vendors roughly the same questions in theory, then we're going to start getting some better answers, because I think enough hits will actually make it important to them. I have spoken with some vendors that are very big and that are not based in the US and are not really that concerned about CIP-013. It's going to be tough to try to sway vendors like that. So just, understand you can certainly ask, you may or may not get answers. You may or may not get answers you like.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question. This was mentioned, so Steve, and I'll throw this one your way. One of you had already talked about this, but how can we handle purchases that are through a third party such as Amazon or eBay?
Okay. This has come up many, many times, I think, with every client I've been working with on CIP-013. Generally, what we're calling that is a third party, or in a process design, we're calling it a special acquisition. In other words, it's not the usual type where there's terms and conditions that are applied. Aside from the fact that it should be avoided, in some cases it just simply can't be. What's key there is that there needs to be, obviously it passes over the terms and conditions part, but there needs to be a risk assessment. Again, it goes back to risk assessments and documentation. What's the risk of making this purchase? What are the potential effects, and what are your mitigations? In my opinion, if you have to make a purchase like that of a BCA, you need to really make sure your documentation is tight. The risk assessment needs to be thorough, needs to be well documented, but more importantly, the mitigations need to be well documented and implemented. So I know that's kind of a very broad brush at it, but I hope that that's a helpful explanation.
I'll jump in there, Steve. I think it depends. Contractually, it could definitely be the reseller that's considered the vendor. Although I guess for an Amazon purchase, you don't really establish a contract. But yeah, I think we can look to some of the existing standards for some precedent in this area. For instance, patching. There's for instance Schweitzer hardware that runs Microsoft software, and when patches are released, is the patch source Microsoft or is it Schweitzer? So a lot of that in that situation comes down to your service agreement, your warranty, and the vendor making the patch available to you. So I think there's potentially some parallels that could be drawn here, insofar as both the vendor you purchase from, as well as potentially some tie-in to the OEM vendor as well.
And there's one more thing I forgot to emphasize. in the documentation side of a situation like this. And that's that you really need to document well why you had to do this. So in addition to having your mitigations and your risk assessment, I would highly recommend documenting the reasons why you had to make this purchase through a third party where you couldn't get the T's and C's, and make that part of the evidence stack.
Very good. Patrick, I'll throw this next one your way. What are our options if an acquisition goes to procurement and the vendor we've chosen suddenly refuses to agree to the CIP-013 terms and conditions?
Your options are to perform a risk assessment and decide accordingly. You still have to perform a risk assessment. There isn't an option to not perform a risk assessment. So that's required. And the risk assessment has to cover at least a minimum set of areas. Certainly going above and beyond that is not going to be a bad idea. But if the vendor decides to not participate, not agree to the terms and conditions, you are left with either to choose to continue with this vendor and mitigate risks on your own, or you are left to choose another vendor and go back to the drawing board and pick somebody else. I think over time, you're going to see vendors normalize and standardize on approaches. If you're going to sell in our space and in North America, frankly, you're going to get asked these questions and you're going to have to respond in roughly the same way. The questions right now, unfortunately, we don't have like a standardized vendor questionnaire or a standardized set of terms and conditions. They're all over the map and they look different, whether they come from EEI or NATF or APPA. And that's okay, but the vendors are struggling with how to respond to the variety of questions, I'm sure. But I think by and large, you're left with deciding to go with that vendor or not go with that vendor. Because if you do, and they don't give you any contractual benefit to going with them, then you are left basically dealing with all of the residual risk. The options with risk are to, either accept, transfer, or mitigate. Accept the risk is not an option. Avoiding the risk really isn't an option either. So you're left to transfer, mitigate. Mitigate obviously is one of the options, but transfer is a contractual relationship. So if you can't get if you can't get the transfer, then you are required to mitigate. That there really isn't any other path. So, you may have some long-standing relationships with certain vendors that may be strained or challenged as a result of their failure to participate or reluctance to participate, and add some terms and conditions to offset some of your risk. And if you continue to use that vendor, then you are responsible for mitigating the risks from the supply chain options.
And Patrick, this creates an interesting conundrum that we've run across specific to this situation. For entities that do a cybersecurity risk assessment before terms and conditions are established, this creates a situation where there needs to be a risk reassessment. And don't just lean on what you've already done and push the button, because the whole situation has changed.
Yeah, no, I've seen that as well. It can't be the risk assessment first and then try to get the terms and conditions in. That feedback loop that goes back into the risk assessment, that whether or not the T's and C's exist prior to doing the risk assessment should be a check. And then after you have gone through what you can get in terms of the terms and conditions, because rarely will you get everything you want. There are some guidance documents that are literally asking for everything under the sun to transfer all risk from the utility to the vendor. I would be very surprised if any vendor agrees to all of that. Frankly, just not realistic. So you can ask all you want, and I guess you don't ask, don't know, but it would be very unrealistic for a vendor to do that. That said, you are going to have some balance or mix of what you asked for and what you get. So at the end of that process is when you do the risk assessment, because now you know what you are left to mitigate.
Patrick, did you just draw a parallel between terms and conditions with cybersecurity?
What?
That it has to be baked in up front instead of bolted on at the end?
No, we should wait to bolt security on at the very last minute and then spend twice as much to try to fix the problem. Yeah. Security now in phase 1.
Well, there still might be situations where the risk assessment isn't done until after there's T's and until there may be a risk assessment ahead of time because they may already know the vendor, but they may be making a different acquisition. So things still, there's still a risk of some things changing after after a vendor has been determined. So that, you know, so I think it's a good idea for everybody to consider it both directions on that.
Yeah, I agree.
Hey, Patrick, one other thing I wanted to ask, you were earlier talking about transferring the risk, and then later you elaborated and said transferring the risk back to the vendor. I initially interpreted that as, you know, were you suggesting that you could transfer risk with insurance potentially?
Great question. It's either going to be, insurance is left when all else fails, basically. Then you're left to go try to get an insurance claim. And whether you've done your diligence or not, and you read the fine print, you may or may not be covered. And, you know, there's all kinds of issues with things like force majeure, acts of war, if it's nation state malware. There's been tons of really insane precedents set recently with insurance. Now, transferring the risk, basically, you don't get to transfer the risk of getting a violation. You can transfer some of the fiduciary recovery risk is pretty much all you get to transfer. But you can't transfer the risk of a violation and the penalties or sanctions that may come with that. But you can transfer some of the, I guess, fiduciary recovery benefit or risk in there. That's about all you can do. So your coverage is to spend money trying to get the T's and C's the way you like. And then if you are the subject of a violation as the result of some vendor actions that were taken, then you're left to go back and try to fight with the vendor over whether or not it was their fault. So either way, you're going to have a lot of sunk cost in legal fees to try to recover some money for what little bit of transferal you can get in the risk. The reality is you should be prepared to do all of the requirements yourself for every single vendor in the event that they don't do it. Just that's an unfortunate reality.
So if I can reiterate what I think you just said, so I could transfer the risk to insurance, but that would specifically apply to recovery costs. As far as regulatory side, would just be accepting those risks.
Yeah, unless you're mitigating them on your own. Yeah. Right. I mean, doing nothing would be accepting the risk. Yeah. And even then, transferring the risk to insurance, insurance will only cover certain things and depends on what type of insurance you're getting. And you may or may not get coverage depending upon what diligence you put in. The classic example is if a fire happens and you didn't have a smoke detector and a fire extinguisher, chances are you're not going to get any payment. So if you're not doing some minimum level of diligence, then the insurance payout is likely not going to happen. So it's, you know, transfer of risk in your best case is to try to get it in T's and C's. Where you can't, back that up with mitigations and insurance, and you may have some modicum of coverage, but reality is just plan on doing it yourself, and it'll be cheaper in the long run versus trying to pay your insurance fees and pay your lawyers to hopefully stop this from being a big issue.
Right. And if you have a vendor that isn't being responsive, always make sure, just in case that situation comes up, that you can prove your due diligence in everything that you've done in working with the vendor. You're going to be expecting notifications from them, have some sort of methodology in place so that if you're not getting notifications, you'll know. So in some of those cases, we've been recommending that entities actually send out periodic notices to their vendors requesting information, and then keeping that on file. You can't control if the vendor doesn't respond or is lying to you, but you can still prove to an auditor that you're doing what you need to do.
Very good. We got quite a few more questions that have come in, so we'll jump right to the next ones. And Jason, I'll queue you up for this next one, and maybe Steve, if you want to comment. Are there recommendations for entities who may have members of a vendor maintenance group, for example, JUMP? Can there be a group assessment that applies to all members of a maintenance group?
Maintenance group. I think I'm going to defer to Steve on this particular one. I haven't had experience
Okay.
with that.
Yeah, this has come up before, and the premise of this question, if I understand correctly, is can we use a group assessment that's been done elsewhere and apply that to our acquisition? And if it's well documented, I think the answer is yes. And I'm going to defer to Patrick because I know he has some opinions on this. But in my opinion, I think you can do it, but it really has got to be documented well, because I think if an auditor sees that you've taken somebody else's work and you're plugging that in, they're going to want to see proof that it's actually up to par.
Yeah, I thanks, Steve. Yeah, we've seen this before, and there is some guidance language that doesn't perfectly map to this, but is close around accepting kind of third-party assessments of other organizations. Those are fine. I think it really depends on the level of diligence that was applied, to what standard they were held and to what standard they were audited, the quality of the report. It should give you a very high degree of confidence that this fits you well and fits your situation well. If it doesn't fit like a glove, then you're probably going to want to go ahead and do your own assessment. Just think of it this way: you're still required to do your part. So unless everyone in the vendor maintenance group is part of something like a JRO or a CFR together, or there's in some way some contractually situated group behind one registered entity, you're going to be in a situation where multiple parties will have responsibility for the behavior of one. And in that case, the assessment has to fit all of the responsible parties versus just the maintenance group itself. So I would say the answer is yes, in careful situations that could apply. But remember, your mileage may vary, and definitely pay attention to how well it fits your situation.
Very good. Okay, we've got a multiple part question that just came in. So let's peel this one back and start at the top. What is considered a transition from one vendor to another? It seems obvious that this means when an entity chooses to onboard a new vendor, but what about when one vendor buys the vendor from which you had purchased the product? I'll open that one up and see who wants to grab that one first. I think we'll have quite a bit of dialogue on this one.
Short answer, yes. The standard's unclear. It doesn't really get into it. There's a little bit of language in some of the FAQs and even in the standard itself, which brings me to a different sidebar discussion around the fact that there is an insane amount of additional guidance on this standard. Some of it is, I guess, sanctioned by NERC. I'm on the supply chain working group, the guidance team as well, and some of it's not. Your mileage may vary, even with some of the NERC sanctioned stuff. Understand that this standard was written in a way that has required this much additional discussion and this much additional guidance, small group advisory sessions, multiple FAQs, so an entire working group dedicated to producing multiple guidance documents. My personal opinion, the standard should have been written in a way that didn't require this much. That not to speak ill of any of the drafting team members. I know they were under a lot of pressure, but this standard doesn't really give you a lot in terms of transition. So the answer is yes, it could be from one vendor to another, or when by choice, or when a vendor buys another vendor. That is still a transition from one vendor to the other. The difference would be, in some cases, not always applicable if you've got a parent where it is the vendor component is sold to another element within the same parent, and you assess the parent. That may apply, but unlikely. So I would say transition is intended, at least for now, to be interpreted as widely as you've written there, and probably even some more edge cases that were not in your question.
Yeah, good points there, Patrick. I would agree. I think the most illustrative example of a transition would be like BMS upgrade, where you're basically forklifting an entire system for another one. You mentioned, you know, some challenges with the standard, as it were. I frankly was surprised that FERC didn't remand this one and went ahead and approved it.
Yeah, I was surprised as well. Yeah.
Former FERC staff, I think, if I can venture an opinion into what they were thinking, and again, I don't speak for the commission.
I was waiting for that.
You know, I think the good outweighed the bad in this case. You know, it was potentially, from their perspective, better to just get something in place and get the ball rolling, because this is such a significant shift. You know, a departure from what the other standards in the NERC CIP space have looked at up to this point.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, there's more to that question. And you're on mute.
Yeah, actually quite a bit more. So would CIP-013 only come into play if we purchase a new product from the new owner or vendor? What if the new vendor owner releases a patch upgrade for the product purchased from the old vendor? Are we expected to perform a risk assessment prior to installing the patch? So Leonard, I'm going to pick on you for that one, specifically around the patch piece. Leonard, I don't know if you could hear me. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
I was just rereading the question again.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
I like to think before I speak typically, but it doesn't always work that way. I digress. I would say, yeah, I mean, the risk assessment is still expected. You know, this patching would clearly fall into software from a vendor as part of your BES cyber system, again, assuming it's on one of the applicable systems, high or medium. Yeah, I don't think that the vendor change changes the expectation there.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think the part about any guidance on how to meet compliance with CIP-013 if you're faced with a merger acquisition type scenario without prior knowledge, I would say almost all of the mergers and acquisitions will happen without your knowledge. The news will drop one day and it'll say, you know, company X buys company Y. And you may or may not even be paying attention to the news feed that provides that. So plan for that, because that is the situation that will likely happen. And that's kind of how it happens, frankly. So yeah, that would qualify as well in terms of the risk assessment. Just think of it in terms of, if you're probably asked the question, if you're asking the question of should we perform a risk assessment, the answer is probably yes, because your auditor is likely going to have the same kind of head scratching moment of, well, should they have performed one? And that's going to cause them to ask more questions as to why you did or didn't, and what was the situation. And so you're going to be left in some cases trying to prove the negative if you didn't just kick off the process and take a look at things real quick and give it at least something that looked like from 10 feet away a risk assessment. So I would say if you're asking yourself whether you should perform one, the auditor is likely going to ask that same question. So, you know, get used to running through this process, get used to kicking it off and looking at what the evidence looks like, because it's likely going to happen in a lot of cases where you didn't expect it to.
Very good. And I think, Patrick, if you wouldn't mind commenting, Dave had put a comment out there as well on that question. So would you mind commenting on Dave's response?
I get all the Dave stuff. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate this. That's okay. I'll handle Dave. This is wrapping all of your activities of CIP into CIP-013. The risk of where the update or patch comes from may come into play. The rest of CIP handles your need to update or whatever. Yeah, there are standards around how you manage your patching and your software sources, and patch sources at least. Now CIP-013 handles software sources as well. There are some additional benefits to the rest of the standards in terms of risk mitigation. I think the challenge is going to be, the expectation is that you don't just go back and say, yeah, we're doing the rest of the CIP standards, so risks mitigated. You're going to think of it as this CIP-013 standard was intended to insert a new link in the chain. And if you remove that link, what else are you doing beyond what already exists in the CIP standards? Frankly, you can't just say, yeah, we're doing the rest of the CIP stuff as your mitigation efforts. Some of those mitigations may need to be different actions that are not specifically required in the standards. Things like additional auditing, additional account management, controls on accounts, restriction of permissions. There's all kinds of other things in your security tool chest that you can use that are not required in the standards. And I'm sure I'm the first to say it, but frankly, the CIP standards are a low bar, and I hate to be that way. I know I've got a lot of utilities that are struggling with this, but from a security standpoint, it doesn't touch all of the controls. You do need to look at what you're doing for the rest of the CIP standards in terms of how risk is mitigated, but don't rely on them solely to mitigate all the risk that comes from the risk management standard in CIP-013 for supply chain.
Thanks, Patrick. Jason, Normandy asked a question. Do entities need to take care or assess other things outside of cybersecurity risk, like reputation of vendors, as it relates to CIP-013?
Sure, yeah. Well, at a bare minimum,
I added that last part. Sorry.
No problem. At a bare minimum, they need to assess at least the capability to implement the 6 controls required by our 1.2. Beyond that, the entity should look and see what's important to them from a cybersecurity perspective, and analyze those controls on a semi-frequent basis at least. So determine what's important to your organization and assess vendors based on that. So if for example, if vendor reputation is something you deem is pretty important, it's something I'd recommend putting in there, at least at a minimum, to assess that on a semi-frequent basis. Include that as a party risk assessment. You can also incorporate some of the additional areas of the CIP standards as a party risk assessment as well too, to see if those vendors have processes in place to address those as well, to make your job easier at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I would add, I totally agree. And I would also add that reputation of a vendor, depending upon how you're looking at it, can be cybersecurity related. So, you know, for example, in the sample questionnaire that we formulate with our clients, we consider questions like, is the product or service a well-known industry solution? Does the vendor's product or service appear in any of the industry advisory URLs? And those kinds of things that do affect reputation. On the other hand, if the question concerns just reputation in general, like is company A considered by many people to be a better company than company B because they make a better product, that's more of a functional issue than a security issue.
Very good. We're really at the end of our questions. I've got one more here that I'll ask, and unless any more come in live, and then I'll do a quick roundtable with each of you to kind of get some parting thoughts on maybe some things that didn't come up that you thought would, or some observations you've made with your many client engagements over the last year and a half on this topic. So the last question I have on this topic is, if the software source does not make a method available for me to verify the identity integrity of the software, do I still have to verify the identity integrity of the software? And I probably should have called on someone first, and Patrick, you took your mute button off, so I'm going to sling it towards you.
Thanks. I guess I got voluntold. The answer is yes. One way or the standard doesn't say you get to not do it because the vendor won't help you. You don't get an exception clause in there, unfortunately. So one way or another, you're going to have to provide some diligence on that. It doesn't specifically say how it's got to be done, but you need to put some level of effort and diligence into it that would be defensible and demonstrable to an auditor. And again, everyone, I said this yesterday, but everyone wants to know what auditors are thinking and their mindset. It's really quite simple. Let's prove it. So if you can feel comfortable that you've proven the fact that you can validate the authenticity and integrity of that software, then you can move forward. If you don't feel you can prove that, then you need to continue on the diligence effort to get to that state. But the standard doesn't say if you can, it says you got to do it. So you need to find some way to perform that. And what I think needs to be stated yet again is you do have the option of choosing another vendor. I understand what that means in a lot of cases. Vendor relationships can be very hard to get in certain cases. Municipals are very challenging, and they can only buy from certain people in certain cases on Tuesday with a blue moon. I understand that. But given the fact that this is now a federal regulation, you may have some leverage to work with whatever procurement buttons you need to push, or people you need to take out to coffee or a beer, whatever it might be, but you need to find ways to get with vendors that you can actually work with. If your vendor doesn't give you these things and you still can't prove it, you are either in violation or you get to pick another vendor. That's the unfortunately just straightforward, unvarnished answer.
So I have a slightly different take on that, Patrick. I don't disagree with you, but I'd like to point out that from my perspective, I think the standard, when you look at CIP-013 versus the wording in CIP-010, it potentially creates a contradictory situation. Whereas in 13, it says, that you have to verify the integrity and authenticity. CIP-010 R1.6 states that you have to do that prior to a change and when the method to do so is available from the software source. So,
right.
Potentially, again, looking at explicitly the wording in CIP-010, there is kind of a loophole there that you make an argument that, hey, this method wasn't made available by the software source, so therefore I don't have to comply with this requirement. Again, I don't recommend that. We're way into the compliance versus security debate. Not a secure approach, maybe a compliant one, I don't know. But I would point out that in the event anyone wanted to go down that path, which again, I don't recommend, documentation, you're going to be expected to provide something other than attestation from your vendor that method is not available to you. Also, it may not pass the smell test. Don't forget, you're not the only shop your auditors have been into. So, and odds are, your neighbors are using the same vendors you are. So last week, your auditor may have seen a method to validate integrity and identity. So if they see at your place that you're saying it doesn't exist, then it's going to result in an interesting conversation with your auditors, at least.
Yeah. And Leonard, to add to that, you're right. The standard does say that for CIP-010 R1.6, that the part where I think is the unaddressed potential, creep or expansion of the standards is CIP-013 doesn't speak to just the baseline components, where CIP-010 does. CIP-013 speaks broadly to hardware, software, and services. So that's where I think there is a potential that if you don't do it, you're going to be asked why, and you might have something to stand on. Again, not recommended if you did it for just the baseline components where it wasn't available. But that's going to be risky in the event that some other utility, as you said, has done it or found a way to do it, and you said it wasn't available, or you were just unable to go to the level of diligence that your neighbor did, for example.
Thanks for wrapping that up. We've got just a couple of minutes here. So one note, if anybody has any questions that they didn't get a chance to ask today, my email address is up on the board. Feel free to send me an email and I'll get with the panelists and we'll get you a reply today or tomorrow. Happy to take as many questions as you send us. With that, I'll ask each of the panelists to maybe just give their parting thoughts on topics that maybe we didn't get to and they want to make sure that you leave here thinking about We'll just go kind of in reverse order. We'll start with Jason, Leonard, Steve, and Patrick. We got about a minute or two each. So Jason, anything you want to, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, one of the things I thought that may come up today, specifically around the 6 controls 1.2 is relating to vendor access, was, for example, if an entity does not allow any kind of vendor physical or remote access, are they required to have a process in place to both review the controls as well as mitigate that risk? Highly recommended that you do. Just because you don't allow it doesn't technically mean you need to have a framework to address it. But things change on the fly at companies. You may need to allow something. So you need to have that framework in place and assess any kind of internal controls you could put in place prior to granting of that access. Things such as system monitoring, making sure that the vendor follows your CIP-4 access controls, using your PRAs, things of that nature. So make sure you documented those particular requirements within your plan and just have that ready to go in case you need it.
Great, thank you, Jason. Leonard, parting thoughts from you.
Sure. To use one of my signature phrases, how do you define vendor? Vendor is not a NERC defined term, so I think there's going to be some opportunity for some latitude in how this is approached, not only from the entity perspective, but also from the auditor side. If it's not in the NERC glossary of terms, FERC has not officially approved it, so it doesn't carry the weight of law. That being said, there are some guidelines in the GTB for R1 that does kind of talk about the expectations on what a vendor is. But again, the GTBs are not legally enforceable, so hanging your hat on those, your mileage may vary. So I would encourage each entity to document your own definition of what a vendor actually is. Secondly, even though you've got a 3-month reprieve on the compliance date, don't procrastinate. Keep your momentum going and get your implementation done. That also gives you some additional time to kind of kick the tires and see how it's working. Make sure all your documentation is in a row. That's all I got. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and for all of y'all participating, thank you for everything that you do, and stay safe.
Thank you, Leonard. And then Steve and Patrick, you want to round us out? So Steve, got just a minute or so.
Yeah, there's something that comes up with almost every client that I work with about CIP-013, and I want to share it briefly. Bear in mind that CIP-013 is not just vendor. You're not just looking at the vendor. You're looking at the actual acquisition. So one thing I want to leave you with is to be very careful when you're working with vendors that sell multiple, completely different types of products. For example, if you have contract with T's and C's and from a vendor where you've always been buying your firewalls from, and suddenly they're selling something else entirely different, which can happen. Make sure that you do another risk assessment. Even though you've been working with that same vendor, it's a totally different acquisition, and some of the answers to the questions on your risk assessment can be different. And if I was an auditor, I'd be asking questions like, what do you buy from this vendor, and do you have all the appropriate risk mitigations in place? It's been great. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Steve. Patrick?
Yeah, a couple of real quick tips. How do you get started on this? If you haven't started already, you got to get moving. As Leonard said, do not procrastinate. You've got, frankly, no time left. Start with your baselines, your CIP-10 baselines. That'll give you all your software. What hardware does that live on? And then what vendors do you buy that stuff from? That's a great way to at least make sure you've done that check up front to capture who your vendors are. The last piece I'll leave you with is there's a lot of guidance that frankly goes way overboard. I rarely recommend a minimal approach, but I'm not recommending that in this case, but you don't want to get where you've got basically the instant replay camera to figure out if you're compliant, but you do want to get one foot in the end zone. But going overboard on this may become very challenging for you to maintain and sustain, and it may strain the relationships with your vendors. Just be mindful of what your vendors can and cannot do, and they're dealing with a lot of different utilities in some cases in a lot of different countries. So be a little flexible in terms of what needs to get done. This has not been audited yet, so kind of as Leonard likes to say, there's going to be some latitude. We need to see where that's going to go. So if you start out with a particularly onerous or particularly minimal program, you may end up having to add a lot more or pull a lot back. So just be careful and try to target that sweet spot of enough effort to demonstrate diligence without really just absolutely killing yourself with overboard action. That's all I've got. Everybody stay safe. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about CIP-013.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for all the attendees. Tomorrow, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of our O&P standards, specifically O&P standard number 27, PRC 27. So looking forward to having that conversation tomorrow, same time. And you guys have a great day and stay safe. Thank you.